Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. Jacob had always been a light sleeper, but lately, something felt different. It started with small things, the feeling of being watched, a creeping sensation along the back of his neck whenever he turned the lights off. He brushed it off, convincing himself it was just stress, a product of his long work hours and lack of sleep. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible beneath the pattering of rain against his window. A hushed murmur, like the distant voice of someone speaking just outside his room. Every time he lifted his head from the pillow to listen, it would stop. The first night it happened, he thought it was his imagination. By the third night, he wasn't so sure. One evening, after finishing his shift at the bookstore, Jacob returned to his small apartment, exhausted. The air inside was heavy, thick with an unusual stillness. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the dreary weather. The rain had been relentless for days, the gray clouds blotting out any trace of sunlight. He had always loved the sound of rain, soothing, constant. But tonight, it only amplified the eeriness hanging in the air. As he got ready for bed, he hesitated in front of his bedroom mirror. Something about it unsettled him, but he couldn't place why. The glass was clean, reflecting his tired eyes and unkempt hair. Shaking his head, he turned away and crawled into bed. The whispering started again. Jacob's body tensed. The voice was clearer now, though he still couldn't make out the words. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, wrapping around him like a slow, deliberate breath against his skin. His heart pounded as he threw the blankets off and sat up, scanning the room. Nothing. He turned toward the mirror. His reflection was there, of course, staring back at him. But for a fleeting moment, just as he moved, he swore he saw it lag behind, a fraction of a second too slow. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. His pulse drummed in his ears as he forced himself to blink and look again. It was normal now. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself, "You're just tired. It's nothing." He lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chin. The whispering had stopped, but the unease lingered. It took him a long time to fall asleep. That night, Jacob dreamt of shadows. He was standing in a darkened hallway, the kind that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions. The walls were lined with mirrors, tall and aged, their silver surfaces warped and dim. A single flickering light bulb hung above him, casting a feeble glow that barely reached the floor. Jacob took a hesitant step forward, his breath shallow. The mirrors reflected his image, but there was something wrong. His reflection was distorted, his features slightly elongated, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. With every step he took, his reflection moved a half-second too late, its expression twisting into something he did not recognize. Then came the whispering. It surrounded him, pressing into his ears, his skull, his very bones. A cacophony of hushed voices overlapping, whispering his name, whispering things he could not understand. The mirrors vibrated slightly, as if something was pressing against them from the other side. Jacob turned, his pulse quickening. A shadow moved in the reflection behind him. He spun around. Nothing was there. But in the mirror, the shadow lingered, watching. Then, as he stared, transfixed, the glass of the mirrors began to crack. The sound was deafening, echoing through the endless corridor as fractures spread like veins across the reflective surfaces. Jacob stumbled backward, his heart racing, but his reflection remained still. No, not still. It was grinning. Then, with a final, shattering explosion of glass, the mirrors burst apart. Jacob jolted awake, his body drenched in sweat. His heart pounded like a war drum against his ribs, his breathing erratic. The whispering was gone, but the eerie silence that followed was just as unsettling. Taking a shaky breath, he sat up, rubbing his face. It was just a dream, a horrible, vivid dream. He glanced toward the mirror across the room. The sheet covering it had fallen to the floor. His stomach dropped. He knew he had tucked it securely before going to bed. His pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly turned his head to look at the uncovered mirror. His reflection was staring at him, and it wasn't lying down. Jacob leapt from the bed, his breath hitching. He grabbed the sheet and threw it over the mirror, his hands trembling. The moment the glass was hidden, the oppressive feeling of being watched seemed to lessen, but his skin still crawled. He stumbled backward, his legs feeling weak. He needed air. He needed to get out of that room. Without another thought, he grabbed his coat, slid into his shoes, and stepped outside into the rain. The cold droplets stung his skin, but he welcomed it, letting the sensation ground him back to reality. He took deep breaths, filling his lungs with fresh, damp air. Jacob tried to convince himself it was all in his head, that he was just exhausted, overworked, and paranoid. But as he stood there in the rain, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had followed him out of the mirror, and that it was waiting for him to come back inside. Inside the apartment, the sheet covering the mirror shifted. A faint whisper echoed through the empty room. Jacob had never believed in the supernatural. He wasn't the type to scare easily, nor was he prone to paranoia. But after last night, after what he had seen in the mirror, his certainty wavered. He tried to convince himself that it was exhaustion playing tricks on his mind, a side effect of too many late shifts and restless nights. Yet the unease clung to him like a second skin. The morning light did little to shake the oppressive feeling that settled in his apartment. Every corner felt darker than it should be. The walls seemed to breathe, the air thick and stagnant despite the open window. The sheet was still draped over the mirror, but Jacob could feel its presence behind the thin fabric, like an unseen force pressing against it from the other side. He avoided looking at it as he got dressed, hurriedly gathering his things and stepping out into the crisp morning air. The rain from the night before had cleared, leaving the streets wet and glistening under the pale sunlight. He inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the discomfort curling in his gut. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he just needed to get out of his head. At work, he kept himself busy stocking shelves and attending to customers, but his mind was elsewhere. The nagging feeling of being watched never faded, not even under the fluorescent lights of the bookstore. Every time he caught his reflection in the glass of the storefront, he hesitated before looking away, afraid he might catch it moving when he wasn't. Then it happened again. He was restocking a shelf near the back of the store when he caught a glimpse of himself in a small mirror hanging by the employee break room. His reflection should have been turned away, mirroring his actions, but instead, it was staring directly at him. Jacob's breath hitched. His pulse quickened as he turned slowly to face the mirror directly. The reflection mimicked his movement perfectly now, no sign of the eerie lag from before. But he had seen it. He knew what he saw. His own face, staring at him when it shouldn't have been. Swallowing hard, he forced himself to step closer. His reflection did the same. He studied his own tired eyes, his unshaven jawline, the crease in his forehead. Nothing seemed unusual, but the longer he stared, the heavier the air became, as if something unseen was pressing against him. A sudden knock on the break room door snapped him out of his daze. He jolted back, heart hammering. His coworker, Amelia, peeked her head in. "Hey, you okay? You looked kinda spaced out." Jacob blinked, glancing back at the mirror. His reflection was normal again. "Yeah," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Just tired." She gave him a skeptical look, but shrugged. "All right, just don't stare at that mirror too long. It's old and creepy as hell." Her words sent a chill down his spine. Did she notice something too? Before he could ask, she disappeared back into the store. Jacob cast one last glance at the mirror before stepping away, the unease following him like a shadow. That night, Jacob hesitated before entering his apartment. The door loomed before him, an unspoken warning creeping at the edges of his thoughts. But he had no choice. He had to go inside. The apartment was eerily silent when he stepped in. He flicked on the lights, but the shadows seemed to linger just a moment too long before retreating into the corners. His eyes darted toward the mirror. The sheet was still in place. Good. He moved through his usual routine, cooking a quick meal and attempting to distract himself with TV. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was in the way the shadows shifted in his peripheral vision, in the way his own reflection in the dark screen of his television seemed to sit just a little too still. Then, just past midnight, the whispering started again. Jacob froze. It was louder this time. No longer a distant murmur, but a distinct voice. And it was coming from the mirror. His breath came in shallow gasps as he turned his head slowly toward it. The sheet covering it was shifting slightly, as if something was moving beneath it. Then a soft laugh. Jacob stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in his haste. The laughter continued, hollow and cold, echoing around the room though it came from nowhere. His body trembled as he willed himself to move, to do something, anything. With shaking hands, he grabbed the nearest heavy object, a lamp, and approached the mirror. His pulse pounded in his ears as he ripped the sheet away. His reflection was gone. For a long, horrifying moment, the mirror reflected only the empty room. No sign of him, no sign of anything. It was as if he had been erased from reality. Then movement. A shadow unfurled from the depths of the glass, stretching like ink spilling into water. Slowly, it began to take shape. His reflection returned, but it wasn't right. The eyes were too dark, too hollow. The grin stretched just a little too wide. Jacob stumbled back as the reflection tilted its head, as if studying him. Then, in a voice that sounded just like his own, it whispered, "Let me out." The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing against him from all sides. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Then the reflection stepped forward. Jacob barely had time to react before the glass shattered. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was his own face, grinning wickedly from within the shards of the broken mirror. And then silence. The silence after the glass shattered was deafening. Jacob lay sprawled on the floor, his ears ringing, his breath shallow. Tiny shards of mirror glittered across the wooden floor, reflecting fragments of his shocked expression. But his reflection, the twisted, hollow-eyed version of himself, was nowhere to be seen. He wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had been haunting him had vanished along with the mirror. But the apartment was different now. The air was heavier, pressing against him like an unseen force. The shadows pooled in the corners of the room, darker and denser than they should be. A cold draft snaked through the room, raising goosebumps along his arms. Jacob forced himself up, his body trembling, and cautiously stepped toward the broken mirror. He half expected something to reach out from the shattered glass and grab him, but nothing moved. He exhaled shakily. Then the whispering started again. It was no longer confined to the mirror. It was all around him now. Voices overlapping, indistinct yet insistent, pressing into his skull. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block them out. "You let me out," one voice hissed. "You let me in," another whispered. Jacob's stomach twisted. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. His breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned the room, his mind screaming at him to leave, to run. But his body was frozen in place. The shadows moved. They slithered along the walls, pooling together in unnatural shapes. From the darkest corner of the room, a figure began to emerge. It wasn't solid, it flickered like a dying candle, shifting and distorting. But Jacob recognized it immediately. It was him. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, almost broken. Its eyes were black voids, empty and endless. A wicked grin stretched across its face, mirroring the one he had seen in the mirror. Jacob stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his throat. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This isn't real." The figure cocked its head. Then, in a voice that was his own but laced with something darker, it whispered, "Are you sure?" The room plunged into chaos. The walls warped and bent as if they were breathing. The lights flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. The whispering grew into a cacophony, voices screaming, laughing, taunting. Jacob turned and bolted for the door. His fingers fumbled with the lock, sweat dripping down his forehead. He twisted the handle, but the door wouldn't budge, as if the very walls of the apartment had sealed him inside. A slow, deliberate footstep sounded behind him. Jacob didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his eyes forward, but he couldn't stop himself. His head turned, and his stomach dropped. The figure was inches away from him now, no longer flickering, no longer shifting. It was solid, real. Its grin had widened, stretching impossibly far across its face. Jacob threw his weight against the door, slamming his fists against the wood. "Let me out!" The laughter behind him was deafening. It echoed through the room, growing, twisting, until it wasn't laughter anymore. It was something much worse. A sound that crawled beneath his skin, that wrapped around his ribs like icy fingers. Then silence. Jacob's hands were still pressed against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was still. The shadows were gone. The whispering had stopped. He turned around. The figure was gone. No sign of it, no trace. Just the broken mirror on the floor and the remnants of his shattered sanity. Jacob's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, staring blankly at the shards of glass. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt safe. But he didn't, because in every piece of shattered glass, his reflection was still smiling. Jacob didn't sleep that night. He didn't even try. He sat on the floor, his back pressed against the farthest wall of his apartment, his eyes never leaving the shattered remains of the mirror. He had spent the last hour carefully picking up the glass shards, yet no matter how many pieces he turned over, the same horrifying truth stared back at him. His reflection was still smiling. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It didn't react when he waved his hand over the glass or tilted his head in different directions. It was frozen in that eerie, knowing grin, as if it had won some unseen battle Jacob hadn't realized he was fighting. The weight of exhaustion bore down on him, but fear kept him upright. He checked his phone. 4:26 a.m. The night felt endless, stretched far beyond what was natural, the hours dragging by an agonizing slowness. He needed to get out, to leave, but something held him back. Not physically. The door wasn't locked, he had tested it a dozen times. But something inside him screamed that if he stepped outside, something worse would be waiting. So he waited. As the sun rose and the apartment filled with weak morning light, Jacob forced himself to his feet. His body ached, his muscles stiff from sitting in the same position all night. He didn't bother showering or making coffee. He just grabbed his jacket and stepped outside for the first time in what felt like years. The outside world was normal. Birds chirped, cars passed, people walked by without so much as a second glance. A part of him had expected something to be wrong, a red sky or twisted figures lurking in the distance. But it was all the same, ordinary. Maybe he was losing his mind. He walked aimlessly, trying to shake the feeling that the world wasn't as stable as it seemed. He found himself at a small cafe, the kind he used to go to before everything started. He ordered a coffee, his hands still trembling as he lifted the cup to his lips. The warmth helped, if only a little. He didn't realize someone had sat down across from him until they spoke. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jacob nearly dropped his cup. The voice was calm, familiar. He looked up, eyes widening in shock. It was Amelia, his co-worker from the bookstore. "Jesus, you scared me," Jacob muttered, setting his cup down. "What are you doing here?" Amelia raised an eyebrow. "I could ask you the same thing. You haven't been answering your phone." He blinked. He hadn't even thought to check his phone. He pulled it out of his pocket and saw dozens of missed calls and texts. Most were from Amelia, but there were others too, his boss, a few friends, all wondering where he was. "How long have I been gone?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia hesitated. 3 days. Jacob's blood ran cold. That wasn't possible. It had only been one night. He had gone to sleep, shattered the mirror, and walked out this morning. But if Amelia was telling the truth, then time itself had shifted. "I don't," Jacob swallowed. "I don't remember anything past last night." Amelia's expression darkened. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Something's wrong with you, Jacob. You've been acting weird at work, staring at mirrors, whispering to yourself. The last time I saw you, you looked at your reflection and, I swear to God, it moved differently than you did." Jacob's stomach twisted. "It's real," he whispered. "The reflection. It's not me." Amelia stared at him for a long moment before nodding, as if she had already suspected it. "We need to get rid of it." Jacob exhaled shakily. "How? I don't know," Amelia admitted. "But whatever it is, it's getting stronger." Jacob's grip tightened around his coffee cup. He could feel it. The thing in the mirror wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was something real, something alive. And if it had taken 3 days from him, there was no telling what it would take next. That evening, Amelia insisted on coming back to his apartment with him. Jacob didn't argue. He didn't want to be alone. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, as if the apartment itself was reacting to their presence. Amelia stopped at the shattered remains of the mirror. "It's still here." Jacob nodded. "I haven't touched it." Amelia knelt down, picking up one of the larger shards. "If it's in the reflection, then breaking the glass didn't get rid of it." Jacob ran a hand through his hair. "Then what will?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started searching for something. There's folklore about mirrors trapping spirits. Sometimes they need to be covered. Sometimes they need to be buried. And sometimes, she hesitated, sometimes they need to be fed. Jacob felt his stomach drop. Fed? Amelia nodded slowly. If something is trapped in a mirror, the only way to remove it is to replace it with something else. A heavy silence hung between them. Jacob looked down at the shards of glass, at the tiny fragments of his grinning reflection. He knew what she was implying. Something had to take his place. No, Jacob said firmly. There has to be another way. Amelia met his gaze. We're running out of time. Before Jacob could respond, the whispering returned. But this time it wasn't just in his head. It was coming from the shards of glass, from the very walls around them. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped. And then the reflection spoke. Let me out. The room plunged into darkness. Jacob barely had time to scream. The darkness swallowed them whole. Jacob couldn't see, couldn't move, could barely breathe. The apartment, the walls, the broken mirror, all of it had disappeared into an abyss of pitch-black nothingness. And then, the whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't just whispers. It was chanting. A chorus of voices, overlapping, hissing, murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. The sound curled around his brain, coiling into his bones, rattling his teeth. Then light. A single dim glow. Jacob's breath came in sharp gasps as his eyes adjusted. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was standing in an endless corridor lined with mirrors, stretching infinitely in both directions. Each mirror was cracked, warped, reflecting distorted versions of himself, some with hollow eyes, others with mouths twisted into impossible grins. Amelia was gone. Panic surged through him. He turned in frantic circles, calling her name, but the only response was his own voice echoing back at him, distorted and wrong. His reflections didn't move with him. They stood still, watching. Then, one of them stepped forward. Jacob froze. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, but his body refused to listen. The reflection, his reflection, tilted its head, the same eerie, hollow-eyed expression he had seen before stretching across its face. Then, in a voice that was his own but layered with something deeper, something ancient, it spoke. You don't belong here. Jacob's breath hitched. Where is here? The reflection took another step forward, and with it, all the other reflections shifted closer in their mirrors. It was as if the glass no longer held them in place, as if they were merely waiting for the moment to step through. Jacob swallowed hard. Where is Amelia? The reflection grinned. She is still in your world. He felt a cold rush of relief. If she was safe, then maybe. But she won't be for long, the reflection finished. You brought her into this. Jacob clenched his fists. I didn't bring her into anything. This thing was already happening before she knew. The reflection chuckled. A sickening, distorted sound. You think this started when you saw me? When you saw the cracks? No, Jacob. It started long before that. Jacob felt the air tighten around him. The weight of something unseen pressed against his chest. What do you mean? The reflections all smiled in unison. You let me out. A shudder ran through Jacob's spine. His mind reeled, trying to piece together what it meant. He had shattered the mirror, yes, but before that, he had seen the lagging reflection. Heard the whispers. Was it already inside him? A loud crack echoed through the corridor. One of the mirrors split in half, its jagged edges fracturing like a spiderweb. A dark, ink-like substance oozed from the cracks, dripping onto the floor and spreading toward Jacob's feet. He stumbled back. The black liquid writhed, shifting unnaturally like it was alive. He turned and bolted down the corridor, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The mirrors stretched endlessly. No doors. No exits. The distorted reflections followed his every move, their soulless eyes locked onto him, their grins never fading. Then a voice cut through the chaos. Jacob! He skidded to a stop. It was Amelia. Her voice was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. He turned wildly, searching for the source. The reflection stepped closer, now mere inches from him. Its head tilted once more, amused. You can still hear her, can't you? Jacob gritted his teeth. Where is she? The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, palm facing him. The moment it did, pain lanced through Jacob's skull. He cried out, clutching his head as images flooded his mind. Flashes of Amelia, standing in his apartment. The mirror, still shattered on the floor. But something was different. The shards, they were moving, rearranging themselves, piecing back together into a perfect, unbroken reflection. And in that reflection was him. Not his reflection. Him, trapped inside. No, Jacob whispered. No, no, no. The realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't in some alternate dimension. He wasn't lost in an endless corridor. He was inside the mirror. And the thing standing in his apartment, the thing wearing his skin, was no longer a reflection. The grinning doppelganger raised its hand again. This time, the mirrors around Jacob shattered all at once, the glass exploding in every direction. He covered his face, bracing for impact. And then he was falling. The darkness swallowed him whole. Jacob's scream was swallowed by the abyss. The fall felt endless, a weightless plunge into the void, where time lost meaning and darkness pressed in from all sides. His body twisted in the air, but there was no gravity, no up or down. Only the sensation of being pulled further and further from everything he had ever known. Then suddenly he stopped. It wasn't an impact. It wasn't a landing. It was as if something unseen had reached out and grabbed him mid-fall, suspending him in empty space. His breath came in ragged gasps as his heart hammered against his ribs. Light flickered in the distance. A faint silvery glow, like the reflection of moonlight on water. Slowly, it expanded, stretching into thin vertical lines, forming shapes. Mirrors. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, hanging in the darkness like floating doorways. Each one reflected a different version of him. Some standing still, others moving when he didn't, their expressions twisted and wrong. Jacob turned frantically, searching for an escape. But there was none. The mirrors surrounded him, an endless maze of glass and reflections that did not obey the rules of reality. And then one of them stepped out. A mirror directly in front of him rippled, the surface bending like liquid. From within, a figure emerged, identical to him in every way, yet unmistakably not him. Its eyes were darker, its movements slower, deliberate. The moment its feet touched the void, all the other reflections froze, watching. Jacob stumbled back. "What are you?" The doppelganger smirked. "I am you." Jacob's throat tightened. "No, you're not." The reflection chuckled, tilting its head. "Aren't I? I have your voice, your face, your memories. And now, I have your life." A sickening realization crept over Jacob. He had seen it happen, before he fell, before he woke up here. His reflection had stepped out of the mirror, and he had taken his place. He was no longer in his own world. He was on the other side. "You trapped me here," Jacob breathed, his voice laced with rising panic. "You took my place." The doppelganger's grin widened. "I didn't take anything. You broke the mirror. You let me out." Jacob's chest tightened. "I didn't know." The doppelganger's eyes gleamed. "Oh, but you did. The whispers, the warnings. You ignored them. You were curious. And now you're here." Jacob clenched his fists. "I won't stay here. I'll find a way out." The doppelganger let out a low, amused hum. "Oh, Jacob, you still don't understand, do you?" The mirrors around them flickered, shifting. In their surfaces, Jacob saw glimpses of the real world, his apartment, his workplace, the streets outside. And in every single one, the doppelganger was there, living his life, interacting with Amelia, smiling at strangers, blending in perfectly. "No one will ever know," the doppelganger whispered. "No one will ever question it. I will live your life better than you ever did. And you will stay here." Jacob's breath came in shallow gasps. His hands trembled. "Why? Why are you doing this?" The doppelganger's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. "Because that's how it works. One comes in, one comes out. A trade." Jacob's pulse roared in his ears. He had to find a way back. He couldn't let this thing take everything from him. Then a thought struck him. A trade. Jacob's eyes darted to the other mirrors. The reflections were still frozen, but he could feel them watching. Studying. He swallowed hard. If this thing had taken his place, could he do the same to another? His gaze landed on a mirror a few feet away. The reflection in it wasn't his own, but a blurred, shifting figure. A faceless entity, hovering between forms. Jacob's stomach twisted, but he didn't have a choice. He lunged. The moment his fingers brushed the glass, the void exploded with light. A deafening shriek filled the air, and the mirrors trembled violently, their surfaces rippling like water. Jacob felt himself being yanked forward, pulled through the glass as an icy force coiled around his body, dragging him into the unknown. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. Jacob gasped as he hit the floor. Solid ground. His chest heaved as he scrambled to his feet, his head pounding. He was back. The wooden floors of his apartment, the dim glow of the streetlights outside. He turned to the mirror. It was whole again. His reflection stared back at him, perfectly in sync. No lag, no eerie grins. Just him. For the first time in days, he felt relief flood through him. He had done it. He had escaped. But then something shifted. The reflection blinked. Not out of sync, not unnaturally, but slower, deliberate. Jacob's blood turned to ice. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging up the glass. His reflection did the same, and then ever so slightly, it smiled. Jacob stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. The smile on his reflection's face was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A twitch at the corners of its mouth, a flicker of something behind its eyes. He swallowed hard. No, I got out. You're gone. The reflection tilted its head ever so slightly. The movement was too smooth, too controlled, inhuman in a way Jacob couldn't explain. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, as if gravity itself was pressing down on him. Jacob backed away from the mirror, his hands shaking. He needed to get out of here, to breathe, to make sure he was truly back in his world. The apartment felt the same. The same walls, the same creaky floorboards beneath his feet. The dull hum of traffic outside, the neon glow filtering through his curtains. Yet something was off, indistinct but undeniable. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the suffocating silence. Jacob lunged for it, desperate for something, anything, that would tether him back to reality. A message from Amelia. "Jacob, where the hell are you? You missed your shift again. Call me." His fingers hovered over the screen. 3 missed shifts? But he had only been gone for. He checked the date. 3 days had passed since he had shattered the mirror. His chest tightened. He had lost time again. A slow creak sounded from the bedroom. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He turned, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run, to get out. But he forced himself to move forward, step by agonizing step, until he reached the door. He pushed it open. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp on his nightstand. And there, standing in front of the newly restored mirror, was himself. No, not himself. The figure in the mirror was identical to him, every feature perfectly replicated. But it was standing completely still, its arms hanging loosely by its sides. The room around it reflected back exactly as it should be, except for one thing. The reflection of his bed was empty. Jacob's stomach twisted into knots. His hands clenched into fists. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're just a reflection." The reflection moved. Not a simple movement. Not a shift of weight or a tilt of the head. It took a full step forward, pressing its palms against the glass. The light in the room flickered violently, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. Then it spoke. "You don't belong here." Jacob's breath hitched. The voice was his own, but layered with something else, something hollow, something wrong. The whispering returned, a chorus of voices hissing just beneath the surface of reality. The reflection pressed harder against the glass. Cracks splintered outward from where its fingertips touched, spiderwebbing across the surface. The air grew colder, the temperature in the room plummeting. Jacob stumbled back, his mind racing. He had to do something. If this thing got out again. The lamp on the nightstand flickered one last time before the bulb burst, plunging the room into darkness. Then the mirror shattered. Jacob shielded his face as shards of glass exploded outward, slicing through the air. The whispering turned into a deafening roar, as if 1,000 voices screamed in unison. He hit the floor hard, his vision swimming. Silence followed. Jacob groaned, pushing himself up. The air was thick with dust and the sharp scent of something burning. He blinked, struggling to focus. The mirror was gone. Not just shattered, gone. The frame was empty, as if the glass had never been there to begin with. The reflection, the entity that had tormented him, was nowhere in sight. A wave of relief washed over him. It was over. It had to be over. But then he noticed it. His hands. They were shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something worse. The skin on his fingers looked wrong. Too smooth, too perfect, like the surface of untouched glass. He turned his hands over, his breath catching in his throat. Tiny fractures ran along his fingertips, glinting under the dim light. Cracks, like the ones that had spread across the mirror moments ago. A cold horror settled in his gut. He reached for his face, his fingers trembling. His skin felt the same. Harder, cooler than it should have been. Then, from the darkness of the empty mirror frame, the whispering returned. It wasn't over. Jacob wasn't out. He had never left the mirror at all. Jacob's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at his hands. The tiny fractures in his skin gleamed under the dim light, shifting and shimmering like polished glass. He pressed his fingers against his face, the cool, rigid texture confirming his worst fear. He was changing. His heart pounded against his ribs, the reality of his situation sinking in like ice water in his veins. He hadn't escaped. He had never truly left the mirror's grasp. It had followed him, or worse, it had taken him. The whispering continued from the dark void where the mirror had once been, an eerie chorus of voices just beyond his comprehension. They called to him, beckoning. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices weren't just in the room. They were inside his head. "You belong here." Jacob stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him. His body no longer felt entirely his own. His movements were slow, almost too smooth, as if he were a marionette on invisible strings. He needed help. He needed Amelia. Fumbling with his phone, he dialed her number with shaking fingers. The call rang once, twice. Then she picked up. "Jacob." Her voice was thick with concern. "Where the hell have you been? I've been calling you for days." His throat tightened. I don't know how to explain this. Something is wrong with me." A pause. Then, in a softer tone, "What happened?" Jacob hesitated. How could he even begin to put it into words? "The mirror. The one in my apartment. I broke it, but I don't think it mattered. Amelia, I don't think I'm real anymore." The line was silent for a moment. Then she exhaled sharply. "Where are you right now?" "At my apartment. I'm coming over." Jacob wanted to protest, to tell her it wasn't safe, but he needed someone to ground him, to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. "Hurry!" The call ended. Jacob lowered the phone, staring at his distorted reflection in the blank screen. His face was pale, his eyes slightly too dark, his skin glinting unnaturally. A shiver ran down his spine. Then the lamp flickered. The shadows in the room twisted, shifting unnaturally, bending toward him. Jacob forced himself to look away, to not acknowledge their presence. The moment he did, a cold breath caressed his ear. "You're almost ready." Jacob spun around, but there was nothing, just the empty frame where the mirror had been. The doorbell rang. He nearly collapsed with relief. "Amelia!" He rushed to the door and yanked it open. She stood there, brows furrowed, eyes scanning his face. Her expression changed immediately. "Jacob, what's wrong with your skin?" His stomach twisted. If she could see it, then it wasn't just in his head. He stepped aside, allowing her in. The moment she crossed the threshold, she shivered. "What the hell is going on in here?" She rubbed her arms. "It's freezing." Jacob swallowed hard. "Something came out of the mirror when I broke it. Or maybe I went into it. I don't know anymore." Amelia glanced at the empty frame on the wall. "And now?" Jacob flexed his fingers. "Now, I think I'm becoming part of it." She studied him carefully, then reached out and took his hand. The warmth of her touch was comforting, real. "We're going to fix this. Whatever is happening, we'll stop it." Jacob exhaled shakily. "Ow!" She bit her lip. If the mirror let something out, maybe there's a way to send it back. A slow, hollow laugh echoed through the apartment. Both of them stiffened. "Too late," the voice whispered. Jacob's vision blurred. The walls rippled, the air thickening like syrup. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was Amelia calling his name. Darkness. Cold, suffocating, absolute. Jacob could feel himself drifting, weightless, as if submerged in a vast, endless ocean. He reached out, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. The whispering surrounded him, curling through his mind like smoke, distant and yet unbearably close. Then a sensation, gravity returning, a pull downward. His body slammed onto a hard, freezing surface. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. He coughed, gasping, trying to make sense of where he was. A dim light flickered in the distance. Jacob forced himself to sit up. The floor beneath him was smooth, cold, like glass. He turned his head, trying to focus. The space around him was vast, infinite, lined with mirrors stretching endlessly in all directions. But something was different. He wasn't alone. Figures moved within the mirrors, shifting just beyond the glass. Some mirrored his own appearance, but distorted, limbs too long, faces stretched, eyes hollow and empty. Others bore no resemblance to him at all. shadowy silhouettes, writhing masses of darkness pressing against the reflective surface. A slow dread crept over him as he pushed himself to his feet. He turned in a slow circle, his breath shallow. There was no exit, no doors, just mirrors infinite and enclosing. Then a voice, smooth and familiar, echoed from behind him. "You still don't understand, do you?" Jacob whipped around. His reflection stood there, separate from the glass, solid and real. It was him, yet not. It held itself with a confidence he lacked, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. The smile that curled its lips was knowing, almost amused. Jacob clenched his fists. "Where is Amelia?" The reflection chuckled. "She's still in your world. But she won't be for long." Jacob's blood ran cold. "Let her go." The reflection tilted its head. "You still think you have control over this?" It gestured toward the mirrors. "Look around you, Jacob. Do you know where you are?" Jacob swallowed. Inside the mirror. A smirk. Partially. The reflection took a step forward, and suddenly, the mirrors around them shifted. The reflections changed, no longer distorted versions of himself, but scenes from his life. He saw himself as a child, staring into a bathroom mirror, a shadow lurking just behind him. Another scene, his teenage years, seeing something move in the glass but dismissing it as a trick of the light. And then, the night he broke the mirror. Jacob watched as his past self lifted the object and smashed the glass, the shards scattering across the floor. But in the reflection, something different happened. His doppelganger grinned as it stepped forward while Jacob fell backward, pulled into the abyss. His stomach twisted. This was never just about breaking the mirror, was it? The reflection's grin widened. "No, you were marked long before that." A shudder crawled up Jacob's spine. The whispers grew louder, rising into a crescendo, pressing into his skull. He felt lightheaded, his vision blurring. "You don't belong here," the reflection said, stepping closer. "But you let me out, and now I belong there." Jacob's heart pounded. If I was marked, if this was inevitable, then why toy with me? Why not just take over? The reflection's gaze darkened. "Because the trade has to be complete." Jacob stiffened. "Trade? You're not just trapped here, Jacob." The reflection's voice was almost pitying. "You're becoming me." Jacob stumbled backward. The cracks in his skin, his body wasn't his own anymore. He was being replaced piece by piece. His hands trembled as he looked down, the fractures spreading up his arms, his reflection shimmering unnaturally. He had to get out. Now. But how? Then he heard it. A voice, not the whispering, not the reflection's mocking tone, but something else. "Jacob! Amelia!" Hope surged through him. He turned, searching, scanning the mirrors. One of them flickered, the image unstable. Through the distorted glass, he could see Amelia, standing in his apartment, eyes wide with fear, hands pressed against the mirror's surface. She could see him. "Jacob, you have to fight it!" Her voice echoed through the abyss. The reflection snarled. "No!" Jacob lunged toward the mirror, but the reflection grabbed his arm, yanking him back with unnatural strength. The whispers howled, the shadows writhing violently around them. "You can't leave," the reflection hissed. "You're mine now." Jacob gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body tensing. "No, I don't belong here." With a burst of desperate strength, he ripped himself free and lunged toward the flickering mirror. He slammed his hands against it, feeling the cold surface beneath his fingertips. Amelia was on the other side, reaching for him. "Come back," she pleaded. Jacob felt himself being pulled backward, the reflection clawing at him, the abyss trying to consume him whole. His fingers pressed against the glass, and then it shattered. Blinding light engulfed him, searing through the darkness. The whispering turned into agonized screams, the void collapsing inward. Jacob fell forward, crashing onto the floor of his apartment. He gasped, his lungs burning as he sucked in fresh air. The light was too bright, the world too loud. He blinked rapidly, his body trembling. He was back. A warm hand grasped his shoulder. "Jacob!" He looked up, vision clearing. Amelia knelt beside him, eyes filled with concern. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're okay." Jacob turned his head slowly. The mirror frame was empty. No glass. No reflection. It was over. Or so he thought. Because in the farthest corner of the room, unnoticed, a tiny shard of glass remained. And in its surface, something shifted. Jacob lay on the floor, his breath uneven, his heart pounding against his ribs. Amelia's hand remained firm on his shoulder, grounding him, keeping him tethered to reality. He could still feel the weight of the abyss, the chilling pull of the mirrors, the deafening whispering that had surrounded him. But he was back. He was sure of it. The apartment was quiet now, eerily so. The air felt still, unnatural, as if the very fabric of reality had been disturbed and was now settling back into place. Jacob turned his gaze toward the empty mirror frame. The glass was gone, obliterated in the moment he had escaped. His reflection, his other self, was gone. And yet, something still felt off. Amelia helped him sit up. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice careful, controlled. Jacob flexed his fingers, running his hands over his face. The fractures were gone. His skin felt normal again, warm, real. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him through. His eyes scanned the floor. And then he saw it. A single shard of glass. Small, nearly invisible among the dust and debris, but unmistakably there. The moment his gaze landed on it, a deep unease curled in his stomach. He swallowed hard. The glass should have been gone, destroyed. But this fragment had survived. And in its smooth, reflective surface, something moved. Jacob tensed, his breath catching in his throat. He could see his own reflection in the shard, but it wasn't right. It wasn't quite him. The eyes were darker, the expression just a little too hollow. Amelia followed his gaze. "Jacob?" He reached for the shard hesitantly, his fingers trembling as they brushed against it. A chill shot up his arm the moment he touched it. And then the whispering returned. Low, insidious, slithering into his mind like venom. His grip tightened around the glass, a deep sense of dread washing over him. "You thought it was over," the voice murmured. "You were wrong." Jacob's grip loosened. The shard slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floor. He scrambled back, his pulse hammering in his ears. "No," he whispered. "No, you're gone." The whispering turned into a soft, cruel laugh. The shard of glass trembled slightly, as if something beneath its surface was trying to push through. Amelia grabbed his arm. "Jacob, what's happening?" He forced himself to look at her. "It's still here." Amelia's gaze darted between him and the shard. "What do we do?" Jacob clenched his fists, his mind racing. Destroying the mirror hadn't been enough. Shattering it had freed him, but not completely. The presence in the mirror had left a remnant, a piece of itself in the real world. And if it was still here, it meant it could come back. His breath came in sharp gasps. "We have to get rid of it." Amelia nodded. "How?" Jacob hesitated. "Fire," he said finally. "Glass melts. If we destroy the last piece, maybe it'll be gone for good." Amelia didn't argue. She stood, grabbing a small metal dish from the kitchen. "We'll burn it." Jacob picked up the shard with a trembling hand and placed it in the dish. The moment it left his grip, he felt a weight lift from his chest, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, pleading. "Jacob," it cooed. "You need me." He clenched his jaw, grabbing a lighter from the counter. "No," he muttered. "I don't." He flicked the lighter, the flame dancing in the dimly lit apartment. Without hesitation, he tilted the dish, letting the flame kiss the shard's surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shifted. A piercing, inhuman shriek filled the room, shaking the walls. The shard cracked violently, its surface bubbling, warping. Jacob and Amelia both stumbled back, as the very space around them seemed to bend and twist. The whispering turned into frantic screams. "No! No, you can't!" The glass shattered into dust, vanishing in a final hiss of smoke. And then silence. Jacob's knees buckled. He sank onto the floor, his body shaking. Amelia was beside him, watching the dish where the shard had once been. "It's gone," she murmured. Jacob exhaled slowly. He wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that this was truly over. But deep inside, a sliver of doubt remained. Because for just a moment, before the shard had turned to dust, he had seen something. A glimpse of his own reflection, smiling back at him. And this time it had winked. The air in the apartment was thick, charged with something unseen but palpable. The whispering had stopped. The shard was gone. Yet, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he had only delayed the inevitable. He ran a hand through his hair, fingers trembling. "It's over," he whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. But his voice felt small in the vast silence left behind. Amelia stood beside him, watching the blackened dish where the shard had been. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, finally, she met his gaze. "Is it?" Jacob swallowed hard. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that destroying the last remnant had severed whatever tether had bound him to the reflection. But deep down he knew better. Something still lingered. Amelia exhaled slowly. You saw something, didn't you? Jacob hesitated before nodding. It smiled at me. A shiver ran through Amelia. That thing, it was never just a reflection, was it? No, Jacob admitted, rubbing his arms as if trying to shake off a chill. It was something else. Something waiting. Amelia didn't ask what he meant. She didn't have to. The air between them was heavy with unspoken understanding. She took a step toward the mirror frame, her expression unreadable. What if destroying the shard wasn't enough? Jacob tensed. What do you mean? She turned to face him, arms crossed. What if it left something behind? Not just in the mirror, but in you. A cold knot formed in Jacob's stomach. He thought about the cracks he had seen in his skin before. How, even after escaping the mirror, something still hadn't felt right. Had it truly left him? Or had it merely transferred? He forced himself to take a breath. Then we need to make sure it's gone. Amelia nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. But how? Jacob thought for a moment. If the entity had attached itself to him in some way, destroying its physical connection might not have been enough. It had to be purged entirely. His mind drifted back to the whispering, to the reflection's final words. You need me. What if that wasn't just a threat? What if it was the truth? Jacob clenched his fists. We need to find another mirror. Amelia frowned. Jacob, if it's still inside me, then I need to see it, he insisted. If there's even a chance that part of it remains, I have to face it. Amelia hesitated but nodded. Okay, but we do this carefully. Jacob grabbed his phone, opened the camera app, and turned it to selfie mode. He hesitated before looking. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then his stomach dropped. His reflection wasn't quite right. His lips weren't moving in perfect sync. His eyes lingered a second too long when he turned his head. And there, barely visible at first, was a faint crack running across the side of his face. Jacob! Amelia's voice was barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his breathing uneven. It's still there. Her hands balled into fists. Then we have to finish this. Jacob locked eyes with his reflection. The crack deepened slightly, spiderwebbing outward. The longer he stared, the more he could feel it, something crawling beneath his skin, something waiting for an opening. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. Then, without warning, the reflection blinked. And Jacob did not. He recoiled, dropping the phone, his pulse skyrocketing. The camera landed face up, still showing the reflection. And now, his other self was grinning. A voice, his own but layered with something distorted, echoed from the phone. You can't get rid of me. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped. And then the whispering returned. Not from the mirror. From inside him. Jacob clutched his head, the voices slithering into his skull like worms burrowing deep, twisting his thoughts, his memories. His vision blurred as the room around him distorted, warping, shifting like melting glass. Amelia grabbed his shoulders. Jacob, stay with me. He barely heard her over the cacophony in his mind. The reflection in the phone moved closer, its grin widening, stretching beyond human limits. You're mine now. Jacob squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling. No, no, no. Then, from deep inside, another voice emerged, his own. Fight it. He forced his eyes open and turned to Amelia. Help me. She didn't hesitate. Ow! Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps. A mirror brought it here. A mirror can trap it again. Amelia's eyes widened. We need to find one. Fast. Jacob fought to stay upright as the presence inside him clawed at his mind, trying to pull him under. His own thoughts felt foreign, tainted. The whispers surged. Amelia ran to the closet and yanked out a small, handheld mirror. This! Jacob swallowed hard, nodding. Do it! Amelia hesitated for only a moment before she lifted the mirror to his face. The reflection inside wasn't him anymore. It lunged. Jacob screamed as Amelia tilted the mirror, forcing the entity back. The whispers turned into a howl of rage, the air crackling with unseen energy. The reflection twisted, its form unraveling, distorting into a black void that coiled and fought against the confines of the glass. Amelia gritted her teeth. Jacob, help me! With the last of his strength, Jacob pressed his hands against the mirror. A burning pain shot through his body, as if something were being ripped from his very soul. The reflection writhed, its features melting, its voice turning into an agonized shriek. Then, with a deafening crack, the mirror shattered. Jacob collapsed. The air in the room stilled. The whispers stopped. The weight pressing on him lifted. Amelia knelt beside him, shaking. Jacob? He opened his eyes. He was himself again. The cracks on his skin were gone. The presence was gone. Amelia let out a breath she had been holding. Is it over? Jacob turned his head. The broken mirror lay in shards across the floor. And in the largest piece, his reflection stared back at him. Silent. Still. And then, ever so faintly, it smiled. Jacob sat motionless on the cold floor, his breath shallow. The shattered mirror pieces lay scattered around him, glinting like tiny, fractured stars in the dim apartment light. The weight in his chest had lifted, the oppressive whispering silenced. But as his eyes fixed on the largest shard of glass, a sickening sense of unease coiled within him. His reflection was still there. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Jacob swallowed hard. He was exhausted, drained, but he couldn't ignore the truth clawing at the edges of his mind. The entity had been forced back, but was it truly gone? Or had it simply found another way to linger? Hiding in the remnants of the mirror, waiting for another opportunity? Amelia placed a shaking hand on his shoulder. Jacob! He turned to her. She looked pale, her eyes filled with exhaustion and lingering fear. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that the nightmare had ended, but his gut told him otherwise. He tore his gaze from the glass and slowly rose to his feet, his body aching as if he'd been fighting for days. We can't take any chances, he muttered. We need to get rid of every piece. Amelia nodded. Fire. He considered it, then shook his head. Not just fire. We need to make sure it's destroyed completely. Jacob grabbed a trash bag from the kitchen and carefully began picking up the shards. Each piece sent a shiver through his spine as he touched it, as if something cold and unholy still clung to the glass. Amelia helped, though she avoided looking directly at the reflections. Once they had collected every fragment, Jacob sealed the bag tight. We take this somewhere far. Somewhere it can't ever be found. Amelia hesitated. What if we missed a piece? Jacob stiffened. That thought had been gnawing at him too. He glanced around the apartment, scanning for anything they might have overlooked. His eyes landed on his phone, still lying face up on the floor where he had dropped it during the chaos. The screen was dark. Then it flickered. A wave of cold dread washed over him as he picked it up, his fingers hesitant. He pressed the power button and the screen illuminated. His stomach clenched. His reflection was in the front camera. Only, it wasn't mirroring him. The reflection smirked. Jacob's breath hitched. Amelia. She turned. What? He slowly turned the phone so she could see. Her face drained of color. The reflection's grin widened, its eyes filled with a malevolent amusement. Then it spoke. You didn't think I'd let you go that easily, did you? Jacob dropped the phone as if it had burned him. The device hit the floor with a dull thud, the screen flickering, distorting. The voice crackled through the speaker, layered, echoing, like multiple versions of himself speaking at once. You can break the mirror, it whispered. You can burn the glass. But I will always find a way. Jacob's hands curled into fists. He had come too far to let this thing keep its hold on him. He grabbed the phone, his pulse roaring in his ears, and without hesitation, he slammed it against the floor. The screen shattered. A wretched, inhuman scream tore through the apartment, so loud that Jacob and Amelia both clamped their hands over their ears. The lights flickered violently, the walls trembling as if reality itself were being pulled apart. Then silence. Jacob stared at the destroyed phone, his breath ragged. Smoke curled from the cracked screen. The eerie glow of whatever force had been inside finally extinguished. Amelia exhaled shakily. Is it gone? Jacob didn't answer immediately. He waited, listening. No whispers. No flickering lights. No distorted reflections staring back at him. Finally, he nodded. I think so. Amelia leaned against the wall, letting out a breath of relief. Jesus. Jacob knelt down and picked up the broken phone. There was nothing left, just a shattered screen, circuits exposed, no trace of the reflection. Still, he wasn't going to take any more risks. We get rid of this too, he said firmly. And then we move on. Amelia met his gaze. And if it comes back? Jacob's jaw tightened. Then we make damn sure it's the last time. Together, they gathered what remained of the mirror, the phone, and anything that had been touched by the entity. They drove to the outskirts of the city, to an abandoned quarry where no one would ever look. One by one, they threw the pieces into the deep, dark water. Jacob watched as the bag sank, disappearing beneath the surface, swallowed by the abyss. He let out a slow breath, feeling something inside him finally release. It was over, or so he told himself, because as they drove away, neither of them noticed the faint flicker of a reflection in the car's side mirror. Watching, waiting. The drive back to Jacob's apartment was silent. The city lights passed by in a blur, their glow doing little to erase the lingering unease crawling beneath his skin. Amelia sat beside him, her hands gripping her thighs, her breathing measured but tight. They had done everything they could. The mirror was gone. The phone was destroyed. The pieces had been discarded where no one would ever find them. Yet a knot of dread still sat in Jacob's chest, heavy and unrelenting. He glanced at the side mirror. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw something, a dark shape, a flicker of movement. His heart clenched. But when he looked again, it was just his own reflection, staring back at him with exhausted eyes. Amelia must have noticed his tension. "Are you okay?" Jacob forced a tight nod. "Yeah, just tired." That was a lie. He wasn't just tired. He was terrified. They pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark, its familiar structure suddenly foreign. Jacob hesitated before shutting off the engine. Amelia placed a hand on his arm. "Jacob, if you don't want to go back in there, you don't have to." He exhaled. "I can't avoid it forever." They stepped out of the car together, the night air sharp against Jacob's skin. Each step toward his apartment felt heavier than the last. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the knob. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run. But he swallowed the fear and pushed the door open. The apartment was exactly as they had left it. Silent, still, the scent of burnt electronics lingering in the air. Jacob stepped inside first, flipping the light switch. The bulb flickered before steadying. Nothing seemed wrong. Amelia followed, closing the door behind her. "See, normal." Jacob nodded slowly, forcing himself to believe it. They moved through the apartment cautiously, checking every corner. No shadows moved unnaturally, no whispering crawled through the walls. Even the mirror frame, now empty, stood harmlessly against the wall, a hollow remnant of what had once been a doorway to something much worse. Amelia crossed her arms. Maybe we really did stop it. Jacob wanted to believe her. He really did, but something still felt wrong. He walked to the bathroom, gripping the sink as he stared into the new mirror above it. He had replaced the old one weeks ago, back when he had first started seeing the irregularities in his reflection. He let out a slow breath. Normal. His reflection blinked when he did, moved when he did. He ran a hand through his hair, watching the mirrored version copy him exactly. Then, just as he turned away, it didn't. Jacob's heart stopped. He spun back around, his chest tightening, sweat breaking out along his spine. His reflection was still facing him, its head slightly tilted. A slow, creeping smile stretched across its lips. Jacob stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe. "No," he breathed. "No, we ended this." The whispering returned, soft at first, curling through the air like smoke. The lights in the bathroom flickered violently, the reflection's grin widening. Amelia's voice cut through the growing noise. "Jacob, what's wrong?" He couldn't speak. He could only watch as his reflection lifted a hand and pressed it against the glass. A crack splintered through the mirror, jagged and deep, as if something was trying to push through from the other side. Jacob turned and ran. "Jacob!" Amelia called, chasing after him as he stumbled into the living room. The walls groaned, the air growing thick with static, the whispering turning into laughter. The mirror in the bathroom shattered. Wind howled through the apartment despite the windows being closed. The shadows stretched, bending unnaturally, and in the corner of his vision, something crawled across the ceiling. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had never left. Amelia grabbed his wrist, pulling him toward the front door. "We need to get out of here." The door slammed shut on its own. The temperature dropped, their breaths now visible in the dim light. The whispering grew louder, distorted, overlapping voices speaking in broken tones. The walls seemed to close in, the apartment warping around them. Jacob looked at Amelia. "It's inside the apartment." No, the voices whispered. It's inside you. Jacob's vision blurred as a force knocked him back. He hit the ground hard, his head slamming against the floor. He gasped, the world spinning, his body feeling detached from itself. His limbs tingled, his fingers numb. Amelia screamed his name, but it sounded distant, warped, as if she were shouting through a tunnel. The shadows loomed over him, shifting, reshaping. Then everything stopped. Silence. A void of nothingness. Jacob blinked, struggling to push himself up. The apartment was still. No wind. No shadows. Amelia was frozen mid-step, her face twisted in terror, her mouth open as if she had been mid-scream. And standing over him was himself. The reflection. Except now it wasn't confined to glass. Jacob's breath hitched. His reflection, identical in every way, looked down at him with empty, endless eyes. It crouched, its movements fluid, unnatural. Then, in a perfect mimicry of his own voice, it spoke. You shouldn't have come back. Jacob's pulse roared in his ears. His reflection smiled. And this time, it wasn't behind a mirror. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at himself. No, at the thing wearing his face. The reflection crouched over him, its expression unreadable, its empty eyes scanning him like a predator studying its prey. You shouldn't have come back, it repeated, voice layered, distorted. Jacob tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. He could barely breathe. The air around him crackled with energy, thick with an unseen force trying to pull him under. Behind him, Amelia was frozen in place, her expression twisted in terror, her body locked mid-motion. The entire apartment was still. No wind, no sound. Time itself had stopped, except for the thing standing over him. Jacob clenched his jaw. What do you want? The reflection smirked, tilting its head in mock curiosity. I think you know. Jacob's mind raced. He had destroyed the mirror. He had shattered the phone. He had cast away every fragment of glass that had ever held its image. And yet, it was still here, standing before him as if none of it had mattered. Nothing ever really breaks, the reflection murmured, reading his thoughts. You can shatter the glass, but the image remains. I remain. Jacob fought against the crushing weight pressing him down. He forced his arms to move, his fingers digging into the floor as he gritted his teeth. You're lying. The reflection's grin widened. Am I? The shadows in the apartment began to shift, stretching unnaturally. The walls darkened, warping, as if reality itself was being rewritten. The apartment was fading. The world was fading. A memory surfaced in Jacob's mind, his first encounter with the reflection. The first whisper, the first flicker of something wrong in the mirror. This thing had never been just a copy of him. It had been waiting, watching, and now it was claiming what it believed was its. You've been marked since the beginning, the reflection continued, stepping closer. Every time you looked, every time you doubted what you saw, you let me in. Jacob's breath hitched. The whispers returned, louder now, an endless chorus of voices swirling around him, pressing against his mind. He shut his eyes, trying to block them out. You're not real, he whispered. You're just a shadow. The reflection crouched beside him, its voice barely above a whisper. Neither are you. A chill shot through Jacob's spine. The weight pressing down on him intensified, and for a horrifying moment he felt himself slipping, his body turning lighter, his vision dimming. It was pulling him in, dragging him out of existence. No, he wouldn't let it. With a surge of desperation, he reached for Amelia. His fingers barely brushed hers, but the moment they touched, the world snapped back into motion. A sharp, deafening crack split the air. The apartment shook violently. The reflection recoiled, its grin faltering for the first time. The shadows shrieked, retreating, twisting back toward the corners of the room. The grip on Jacob loosened, and he gasped as he forced himself to his feet. Amelia's eyes darted between him and the reflection. Jacob, what do we do? Jacob didn't hesitate. We end this. He lunged forward, reaching for the reflection. It moved to dodge, but this time Jacob was faster. His fingers closed around its wrist. The moment they touched, a wave of cold shot through his veins. The reflection's grin returned, this time, twisted with satisfaction. You can't fight what you are. Jacob ignored it. He pulled, and the room spun around them. A force stronger than anything he had ever felt yanked them both downward. Through the floor, through the walls, through reality itself. The apartment vanished. Jacob was falling. When he hit the ground, it wasn't hard. It wasn't even solid. It was glass. He gasped, pushing himself up. The surface beneath him was smooth and reflective, stretching infinitely in all directions. Endless mirrors surrounded him, forming a vast, glowing labyrinth. He turned, disoriented. His reflection was everywhere, but none of them moved in sync. They stood still, watching. Then he saw it. The reflection, the real one, was standing ahead of him, smiling. "Welcome home," it said. Jacob's chest heaved. He spun around, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. Just the endless mirrors, the countless versions of himself, the warped copies, the missing pieces of his own image staring back at him. He was inside the mirror now. Panic surged through him. He turned back to the reflection, his hands clenched into fists. "Let me out." The reflection chuckled. "Oh, Jacob, you are out." Jacob's breath caught. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head. Through the nearest mirror, he could see his apartment. Amelia was there, standing over his body, his real body. She was shaking him, calling his name. But he wasn't waking up, because he wasn't there anymore. He was here, in the mirror. "No," Jacob whispered, stepping forward, pressing his palms against the glass. "No, no, no." Amelia kept calling his name. Her voice was fading, distant, slipping away like sand through his fingers. Then the reflection stepped up beside him, placing its own hand on the glass. It leaned in close, whispering in his ear. "I told you," it murmured. "You shouldn't have come back." And then, with a final flicker, the connection broke. Jacob's world went dark. And in the apartment, Amelia gasped as Jacob's eyes finally opened. But the man who looked back at her was not Jacob. Darkness pressed against Jacob like an invisible force, suffocating, consuming. The last thing he remembered was Amelia's voice calling his name, fading like an echo lost in an abyss. Now he stood in the middle of an endless, mirror-lined corridor, every surface reflecting an image of himself that was no longer real. Panic clawed at his chest. He ran his hands over his body, desperate for some sensation that would confirm he still existed. His skin felt cool, too smooth, too perfect. He pressed his fingers to his pulse point. "Nothing." "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." The mirrors stretched into eternity, curving in ways that defied logic. Jacob spun around, searching for a way out. But there was none. His own image surrounded him. Hundreds of versions of himself staring back, unmoving, unblinking. Then, from one of the reflections, a figure stepped forward. Jacob's breath hitched. It wasn't his reflection anymore. It was him, the imposter that had stolen his life. The doppelganger stood tall, adjusting his shirt, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Well," it mused, "that was easier than I expected." Jacob clenched his fists. "Let me out." The reflection laughed, shaking its head. "Jacob, Jacob, Jacob, you're still thinking in human terms. There is no out. This is your home now." Jacob took a step forward. "You think you can just take my life? Walk around in my skin like nothing happened?" The doppelganger's grin widened. "That's exactly what I've done. And you know what? It feels good. Breathing, eating, being alive." He exhaled dramatically. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this." Jacob's pulse pounded, even if his body no longer had blood to pump. "Why me?" The doppelganger's expression darkened. "Because you were weak." Jacob flinched. "You let your doubts creep in. You questioned the world around you. You stared into the mirror just a little too long." The imposter leaned closer, whispering, "You invited me in." Jacob's stomach twisted. He had always felt something off about his reflection, had noticed the little delays, the unnatural movements. But he had ignored them, dismissed them as exhaustion or paranoia. And that had been his mistake. He took a step back, his mind racing. If he was in the mirror world, then there had to be a way out. He refused to accept that this was the end. His body, his real body, was still in the physical world. If there was a way in, there had to be a way back. "You're wrong," Jacob said, his voice steadier now. "I didn't let you in. You forced your way in, and I'm going to force you out." The reflection sighed dramatically. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Jacob's jaw clenched. "By breaking the mirror." For the first time, the doppelganger's smirk faltered. Jacob saw the flicker of hesitation in its eyes, and that was all the confirmation he needed. The mirrors, they weren't just prison walls. They were barriers, boundaries keeping him trapped. If he could shatter them, maybe, just maybe, He could tear a hole big enough to get back through. Jacob didn't waste another second. He spun, searching for anything he could use. He grabbed the first thing he could find, an ornate, silver-framed mirror hanging in the air like an abandoned picture. With all his strength, he raised it above his head and hurled it against the ground. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. A scream ripped through the mirror world, a sound not entirely human. The reflections around him flickered violently, their forms distorting, faces melting into a swirl of static and void. The doppelganger staggered back, its form glitching like a corrupted image. "No, stop." Jacob didn't stop. He grabbed another mirror, this one massive, almost stretching to the ceiling, and slammed his fist against it. The pain didn't register, but the impact did. Cracks spread across the surface like lightning. The entire world trembled. The reflections shattered one by one, glass exploding outward in a storm of splintered light. The corridor buckled, twisting into itself, walls bending and warping as if reality itself was unraveling. A force stronger than anything Jacob had ever felt yanked at him, pulling him forward. The mirror world was collapsing, the fractures widening, the void reaching for him. And then, he saw it. A single unbroken mirror, standing tall in the chaos. And beyond its surface, Amelia. She was in his apartment, staring into the cracked remains of the bathroom mirror, her hands gripping the edges of the sink. Tears streaked her face. She was calling his name. Jacob lunged forward. He pushed through the void, through the splintering walls of glass. The force against him was immense, but he refused to be left behind. He stretched out his hand, fingers inches from the surface. The doppelganger screamed behind him. "No, you don't belong there." Jacob ignored it. With one final burst of strength, he reached through the mirror, and the world turned white. Jacob gasped as he jolted upright. His lungs burned as he sucked in air, his vision swimming. The apartment swirled into focus, dim lighting, the scent of burnt-out candles, the chill of night air seeping through the window. He was back. Amelia was beside him, her hands clutching his shoulders. "Jacob? Oh my God, Jacob!" He turned his head, his pulse hammering. His reflection in the broken bathroom mirror stared back at him, in sync. The doppelganger was gone. He exhaled shakily, his entire body trembling. Amelia pulled him into a tight embrace, her breath hitching with relief. "You were gone. I thought I lost you." Jacob closed his eyes. He had almost been lost, but he had made it back. But just as relief settled into his chest, something caught his eye. In the corner of the room, among the shattered glass, a single shard remained intact. And within it, barely visible, a shadow moved. Jacob's blood ran cold. It wasn't over. Not yet. Jacob sat motionless on the cold floor, his breath still ragged from the fight to reclaim his reality. Amelia remained close, her fingers digging into his arm as if afraid he would vanish again. The apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound their heavy breathing. But Jacob's attention was fixed elsewhere. The single shard of unbroken glass in the corner. From his position, he could barely see the surface, but he knew what he had glimpsed, a movement, a shadow shifting just beneath the reflective plane. His heart pounded. He had shattered the mirror world, torn through the void, yet something had remained. Something had survived. Amelia followed his gaze. "Jacob," she whispered, "tell me you don't see anything." Jacob swallowed hard. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her it was just a piece of glass, nothing more. But he knew better. He had learned his lesson about ignoring things that felt wrong. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet and took a hesitant step forward. The floor creaked beneath him, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the apartment. His pulse roared in his ears as he knelt before the shard. It was small, no bigger than his palm, and yet the darkness within it felt infinite. He reached out. Amelia grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she pleaded. Jacob hesitated, but something inside him knew he had to. He had to be sure. His fingers brushed the edge of the shard. A jolt of ice shot through his veins. His vision flickered. The room around him warped, the walls bending inward, shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. He gasped, stumbling back, the shard slipping from his grasp. Amelia caught him before he fell. "Jacob, what happened?" Jacob pressed a hand against his forehead, trying to steady himself. His vision swam, but the moment he blinked, everything snapped back to normal. The walls were solid. The shadows were still. But the whispering had returned. faint like a breath against the back of his neck. Jacob turned sharply, but there was no one there. He faced the shard again. His own reflection looked back at him, but only for a moment. Then its head tilted just slightly. A grin curled at the edges of its lips. Jacob's breath hitched. The reflection whispered, "Did you really think you won?" The room went black. Jacob's eyes snapped open. He was standing in a space that wasn't his apartment. That wasn't anywhere. The air was thick, oppressive. The floor beneath him was made of smooth, polished glass, stretching infinitely in all directions. He was back. "No," he whispered, turning wildly. "No, no, no." His reflection stood in front of him. But this time there were many. Dozens. Hundreds. All around him, stretching into the void, standing behind invisible mirrors. They were all him, but twisted, warped, some with hollow eyes, others with elongated grins, some staring at him with expressions of pure malice. The closest one, the one he had fought, stepped forward, arms folded. "You didn't break me," it said, voice calm, almost amused. "You only delayed the inevitable." Jacob shook his head. "I destroyed the mirror." The reflection laughed. "Did you?" Jacob's stomach twisted. The mirrors around him began to reassemble. Piece by piece, the shards of the broken world knitted themselves back together. The fractures sealed, the cracks vanished, the darkness shifted. The realm he had shattered was repairing itself. And he was still inside. "You thought you escaped," the reflection continued, stepping closer. "You thought you won. But the truth is, Jacob." The whispers grew louder. The other reflections began to move, their bodies twitching, their faces distorting. "You never left." Jacob's breath hitched. "No," the reflection smirked. "And you never will." A hand grabbed his shoulder from behind. Jacob screamed. "Jacob!" His eyes snapped open. He was lying on the floor of his apartment. Amelia was kneeling over him, shaking him. Her eyes were wide with panic. "Jacob, what the hell just happened?" His chest heaved. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He wasn't sure how much time had passed. His limbs ached, his head pounded, and a cold sweat coated his skin. But he was here. He was back. Amelia helped him sit up. "Jacob, you weren't breathing." He swallowed hard. He cut himself off, his hands clenching into fists. He turned toward the corner where the shard had been. It was gone. Amelia followed his gaze. "Where is it?" Jacob pushed himself up, scanning the floor, his heart racing. The piece of mirror was nowhere in sight. Then something caught his eye. The full-length mirror in the hallway. The one he had deliberately avoided since all of this had begun. There, in its surface, the shard was embedded. A single, jagged crack ran through the glass, pulsing faintly with something dark. Something alive. Amelia took a step back. "Jacob!" He exhaled sharply. "It's not over." And from within the mirror, just beneath the fractured surface, a reflection smiled and whispered, "See you soon." Jacob's breath came in slow, measured gulps as he stared at the full-length mirror. The crack running through its surface pulsed faintly, as if something behind it was breathing, waiting. Amelia stood beside him, her expression frozen somewhere between fear and disbelief. "What do we do?" she whispered. Jacob clenched his fists. He had fought his way out before, but the entity had survived. He wasn't going to let it take hold again. Not this time. "We end this," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. Amelia hesitated. "What if destroying it makes things worse?" Jacob met her gaze. "Then we contain it." Amelia swallowed, nodding. "How?" Jacob's mind raced. Destroying the original mirror hadn't worked. Shattering the pieces hadn't worked. The entity had latched onto every reflection it could find, like a parasite clinging to its host. It wasn't enough to break the glass. It had to be sealed. He thought back to the lore he had read, stories of mirrors as gateways, as prisons. Some said spirits could be trapped inside. Others said they could be banished forever if the right ritual was performed. He had no idea what would work, but he had to try. He turned to Amelia. "Salt. Candles. We're making a barrier." She nodded without hesitation and ran to the kitchen, grabbing the container of salt while Jacob rummaged through drawers for candles. Within minutes, they had created a circle around the mirror, the dim light flickering against the cracked glass. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with something unseen but watching. Jacob stood at the edge of the circle, heart hammering. He had no incantations, no ancient knowledge. All he had was determination. He stepped forward and placed both hands on the glass. The moment his fingers touched the surface, the world shifted. The apartment disappeared. Jacob gasped as he stumbled backward. The mirror had swallowed him whole. He was back in the void. The infinite mirrors stretched around him, glowing faintly. But unlike before, they were fractured, their surfaces cracked, distorted. The world was falling apart. And then it appeared, the reflection. No longer a perfect copy, no longer wearing his face with ease. It was crumbling. Its form flickered, its grin unsteady, its limbs distorted like a twisted marionette whose strings had been cut. It was weakening. Jacob steadied himself. This was his chance. He stepped forward. It's over. The reflection snarled, its form glitching, static crackling around its edges. You think you can get rid of me? Jacob clenched his fists. I know I can. The mirror world shuddered. Cracks webbed outward in every direction. The entity screamed. Jacob reached forward and grabbed the doppelganger by the throat. It felt cold, like holding onto solid ice. The moment he touched it, pain ripped through his skull, memories flashing in rapid succession. The first whisper, the first flicker of something off in the mirror, the first time he had doubted his own reality. The reflection clawed at him, desperate. You need me. Jacob gritted his teeth. I never did. With every ounce of willpower he had left, he shoved the reflection backward, into the largest fractured mirror. The entity screamed as it hit the glass. The surface rippled, warping, sucking it in like a black hole pulling in light. Jacob stepped back. The mirror imploded. A deafening crack echoed through the void as the entire mirror world collapsed. Jacob's body lurched forward, and he fell. Jacob hit the ground hard. His apartment. He gasped, his lungs burning as he sat up. The mirror in front of him was whole. No cracks. No pulsing darkness. No whispers. The entity was gone. Amelia knelt beside him, her eyes wide. Jacob. He turned to her, his breath unsteady. It's over. She stared at him, as if trying to confirm he was real. Then, after a long pause, she pulled him into a tight embrace. Don't ever do that again. Jacob let out a shaky laugh. Trust me, I don't plan to. For the first time in what felt like forever, the apartment was silent. No whispers. No flickering lights. No reflections staring back at him. It was truly over. 1 week later, Jacob stood in front of a dumpster, the mirror in his hands. Amelia watched as he took one final look at his own reflection. No flickers. No hesitation. Just him. With a deep breath, he let it go. The mirror hit the metal with a dull thud. Jacob exhaled. Amelia grabbed his hand, squeezing gently. Come on, she said. Let's go. Jacob nodded. As they walked away, he didn't look back. And if he had, he might have noticed the tiny shard of glass that had fallen onto the pavement. A shard that, just for a second, caught the light of an impossible grin.